Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for coming tonight to this public lecture organized by King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. Our guest tonight is Professor Ulrike Freitag. She is going to speak about the hospitality in the Guest of God, pilgrimage, and cosmopolitanism in the port city of Jeddah. We are delighted to have you tonight, Professor. And Professor Freitag, she is the director of the Center of Modern Oriental Studies in Berlin, as well as she is a professor of the Institute of Islamic Studies in the Free Berlin University. She is the historian of the modern Middle Eastern studies, with a special interest in the urban history in the Arabian Peninsula and its global context. She is the advisor council member of the Lebanese Institute of European History in Myrnals and international advisory council member at the World Congress of the Middle Eastern Studies. Tonight's speak is going to be very interesting, but before I start, I will deal just with 4 formality. If you can, please switch off your phone in silent mode before we start. So we're going to speak for 45 minutes, then we can have the Q&A questions. Thank you.
شكرا لهذه المقدمة. فأعتذر من الآن أني سأتكلم باللغة الإنجليزية لأنه التفاصيل تعبى أحسن بالنسبة لي في اللغة الإنجليزية من العربية. فقبل ما أبدأ بالمحاضرة نفسها أردت أشكر مركز الملك فيصل وخاصة الدكتور سعود سحان لهذه الدعوة اللطيفة وكمان للمجموعة التي تساعده. فهذه المحاضرة هي مؤسسة على كتاب الذي ألفته فسيصدر في السنة المقبلة إن شاء الله عن تاريخ مدينة جدة. وبالفعل شجعني المركز في البداية وهذا من سنوات طويلة جدا بالدراسة عن تاريخ المملكة العربية السعودية. فلذلك أنا مسرورة جدا جدا بوجودي هنا اليوم وأشكر المركز وهذا يعني نوع من الشكر للمركز أيضا. I'm going to switch to English now, and please my apologies for that. Why am I talking of the guests of God? That is how in the Jeddawi perception Muslim pilgrims were and are still conceptualized in the Hijaz. This concerns first and foremost the destination of the pilgrims, of course. It concerns Mecca and Medina, but to some extent also in Jeddah people talk of the guests of God who had to pass through this Red Sea port. And actually in the 19th century, and again apologies for using Miladi rather than Hijri dates, but I've transferred all the dates into Miladi and then I was too lazy to transfer them back. So in the 19th century Miladi, about 80% of all pilgrims who went to Mecca arrived through the Red Sea port of Jeddah. And actually towards the end of the 19th century, when steamshipping had really taken over and when traveling became much easier, and I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment, an even greater portion of all pilgrims came via Jeddah because they had switched from using the caravans. And only to some extent the Hijaz Railway took away another portion of these pilgrims. So it's really the most important entry point of pilgrims for the Hajj. And nowadays, I think about 95% of all pilgrims arrive, of course, nowadays by air. The question now is how, and that is what I'm going to deal with in this talk, the question is how in the 19th century could a very small city such as Jeddah, which had about 15,000, between 10 and 15,000 inhabitants in the 19th century, how could that cope with the arrival and sometimes the rather long-term stay of anything between 10 and 100,000 pilgrims annually? There was a second and more permanent presence of strangers as well in Jeddah, and these were the merchants, these were also the sailors, these were travelers who came to Jeddah and might have stayed for a while and left again, or they might actually have settled down there, depending on their fortune. And these people became quite well settled in Jeddah, and after a generation or two were considered to be proper Jeddawis. So very often also these categories of pilgrims and of other arrivals or immigrants cannot easily be separated, because many of the pilgrims would have arrived, and if they found good living conditions, if they missed their ship back, if they married, they might have stayed in Jeddah for a year, for a couple of years, or for the rest of their lives. Now, what is the city we are talking about? This is an aerial view of Jeddah in 1938, so it's already well into the 20th century. The city had about 20,000 inhabitants by then. And you can see, to some extent, also the urban development which had taken place from the middle of the 19th to the middle, or to this period. You can see that this really is the old part of town. This is the main souk, which was used for trade. You can see here the large structures, which are ahwash, the places where the goods would have been stored. And you can see here an important access crossing the street from the port to Bab Makkah, to the gate from where people and goods traveled to Mecca. Whereas you have here this other axis, which then leads to the Bab el-Madina, which of course is where the caravans for Medina and the northern part of the Hijaz started. In the 19th century, the Ottomans, who are often accused of not having done anything fil bilad in the Arab world, actually expanded and built all of this area. They put a lot of dirt and waste from the city into the sea, and thereby gradually, in a number of different steps from the 1960s until the 1990s, actually reclaimed this land on which they built the new port facilities, the new customs house, new health facilities, new storage facilities, a passports office, and so on. So what did the arrival and oftentimes sojourn of strangers do with the city, and how did people conceptualize this locally? My lecture will consist of 4 parts. I will start with a little bit of background on the history of Jeddah and the Red Sea. I will talk about the local organization and accommodation, local organization of the Hajj and the accommodation of the pilgrims, then about some of the urban institutions and religious practices which helped to integrate the pilgrims, and finally about how people locally talked about this presence of strangers. And of course I'm talking about history here, but the presence of strangers in our societies, certainly in Germany these days, is a huge topic. How should we deal with immigrants? Are they part of us? Should we send them back to their countries? These are questions which to some extent also troubled the Jeddawis and the Ottomans who were ruling in the 19th century, but which were, I think, solved in a somewhat more flexible and lenient way than this is nowadays the case, at least in the country I'm coming from. Now let me start with a background on the history of Jeddah and the Red Sea. And here you see a German map from the early 20th century. It's interesting that it comes from a handbook for travelers going to India, which already indicates why the Red Sea was quite important. It was one of the main thoroughfares between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. And you can see Jeddah quite exactly in the middle of the Red Sea area, close to Mecca. To the south, you can see the important port of Aden, and then a lot of other ports, to which I'll come back with a better map as well. Now, in 646 or 47, Uthman bin Affan, the third Muslim caliph, declared Jeddah to be the official port of Mecca, and that really marks the rise of this particular settlement to a city. There were other earlier settlements before. It's not entirely sure, and I think here archaeology in the future will have quite a big task. It's not yet quite sure what the earlier settlements were. There's a lot of talk about Shaiba. Nobody knows exactly where this was located. There are other names which sort of float around as possible earlier settlements, but Jeddah, in the place where it is now, was founded in the mid-7th century as a station, as I said, for the pilgrimage. But of course, also, if it's a major station for the pilgrimage, it's also a major port to supply the pilgrims, because they need to eat, and the Hijaz is not known to be a particularly agriculturally fertile land. So much of the grain had to be imported, notably from Egypt, from the Sudan across the Red Sea. And later, of course, you also get lots of rice from India and all sorts of other goods. Now, Jeddah was chosen because of its proximity to Mecca, because it is a natural place for a harbor, because of the wind regime in the Red Sea. And you can see here that you can sail all year round very nicely down the Red Sea. All year round, it's very difficult to go up the Red Sea. And in the southern Red Sea, basically starting from Jeddah, you can sail towards the Arabian Sea and across the Indian Ocean between May and September, whereas between October and April, with the Mawsim, with the monsoon, you can travel all the way up to Jeddah. And Jeddah is really where the wind regime changes, which is why strategically this was such an important location. Now, there were also disadvantages, at least in the age of sailing. Obviously, this is important, but the disadvantages were the coral reefs, which also made the use of smaller sailing boats up the Red Sea more convenient. But the coral reefs actually also prohibited direct access to the shore at Jeddah. And then there was another very big problem, that was the lack of water. And this was solved in Jeddah in different ways. There were saharij cisterns built in the houses, often under the houses, and you would collect the water on the top and it would run down to the underground cisterns, but that didn't really cover all the water needed. There were water pipes laid already from Mamluk times, bringing water from the nearby mountains, from sources there, to the city of Jeddah. And there were massive dam works outside of Jeddah, which you can see on aerial photographs, where rainwater, the little rainwater there was actually collected and led into large underground saharij outside of the city of Jeddah. And to own them actually made people quite rich. Then, of course, there were people who would bring water by animals of burden from the nearby mountains. And finally, from the early 20th century, you have the first Kandasa, the first seawater desalination plants. So you have that already in the late Ottoman period. The Red Sea was, as I already mentioned, an important thoroughfare, and Jeddah was an important, but by no means the only port. You can see opposite Jeddah Sawakin, you can see Massawa, and you can see Aden, which from the 1830s, when it was occupied by the British, was expanded to become a very important port for the British trade with India. And you can see at the top here Suez. So Suez and Aden are really the two cities which, during the 19th century and due to British imperialism, became extremely important and rivaled, really, the role of Jeddah. So if people, when you go to Jeddah and you visit the old city, sometimes people tell you, well, always, since it was founded, was a very important city. And that's not quite right, because depending on political conditions, both locally, for example, the relationship between the Ashraf Makkah and the Mamluk and Ottoman governors of Jeddah and later of Mecca, or depending also on larger geostrategic considerations, some of the other ports could become, in different phases, more important. So, for example, Mocha, for a long time, was more important than Jeddah because foreigners were allowed to settle here and trade in coffee, and they were actually not allowed to trade in the Red Sea until quite late in the 18th century, although the British and the French tried a number of times. Sorry, is there some water here? I've got a... Now, Jeddah was not just an important port to travel through the Red Sea. It was also the most important port to bring goods to the interior. So you have from Jeddah caravans going to, of course, to Mecca and Taif, but also to Medina, to the Najd. Sometimes there was even trade with India, which went via caravan through to the Gulf and then to Iraq and India. Now, with the introduction of steam shipping in the 19th century, and then the opening of the Suez Canal, Jeddah lost some of its importance as a point of transshipment. Goods would travel directly from Aden to Suez, notably when the technology improved and places such as Jeddah were no longer needed to put coal onto the ships. And so it lost some of its importance in trade, but this was compensated to a large extent by the increase in the number of pilgrims. And this will now lead me to the second part of my talk, which is about the pilgrimage. Here you can see a number of the pilgrimage routes in the 19th century, and the Muslim pilgrimage was called by Michael Pearson the first regular passenger route in the pre-modern period. So long before the British established their routes to India, etc., the pilgrimage was an annual recurring event conducted mainly by camels and by sailboats. I mentioned already that with the monsoon winds, many of the pilgrims had to stay for a long time in the Hijaz, and if they were unlucky and arrived just after the pilgrimage, they at least had to stay for 1 year to complete the pilgrimage and then travel back. And if they were unlucky, they had to stay for even 2 or 3 seasons before they could make their way back, which already shows that pilgrims at times could become sojourners in places such as Mecca and Jeddah. And again, this changed with steam shipping. So more pilgrims came, but they also stayed for shorter periods. The transport of pilgrims was a hotly contested business, with many attempts at creating monopolies of transport. And these monopolies were mostly created via ticket sales. For example, there are lots of documents about an agreement between some merchants in Mecca from a particular family who also had a branch in Singapore, and the Dutch consul, and sometimes only officials at the Dutch consulate, who teamed up to force all pilgrims traveling from Southeast Asia to buy their tickets through this monopoly, which then, of course, increased prices dramatically. And to some extent, the British were also at times involved in similar issues. Now, this control of the pilgrims' traffic, of course, was first and foremost an economic business. But there were other reasons why particularly European powers were interested in this. I'm really sorry, I got a cold. The first was the control of poor pilgrims. Like today, there was a tendency to try to get rid not of rich immigrants, but of poor immigrants. And notably, the Ottomans were very good in forcing the British and the French and the Dutch to take back those pilgrims who didn't have return tickets. And therefore, the British tried to make sure that all the pilgrims traveling from India would have a return ticket. And what was easier, there was nothing easier than actually having one company, Thomas Cook, the famous travel agent of later days, trying to have one company dealing with all of this. Made it much easier practically. Then there was, of course, the question of political control. It's the 1880s when for the first time, late 1850s, sorry, when for the first time there is fear of, it wasn't called Pan-Islam then, but it actually was Pan-Islam, when there was fear of Pan-Islamic movements spreading and potentially fighting insurgents, fighting imperialism. And I think the starting point of this was the Indian uprising of 1858, when some of the people from there actually traveled to the Hijaz. And the British were extremely wary of this. They thought that the subsequent uprisings in the Hijaz were also linked to this, that there was a general uprising of Muslim peoples against whoever, against the British, against the Ottomans, and so on and so forth. So there was a lot of emphasis on political control, on movement. And the final issue, which I won't go into further, is the health issue, because in the 19th century you have huge cholera epidemics reaching all the way to the US. And so there was an international regime trying to control movement at a time when it wasn't quite clear how illnesses such as cholera were actually spread. So you have a number of reasons why there was a lot of what we nowadays would call surveillance, actually, and control. In all of this, the fate of the pilgrims was quite secondary, and you can see here an image from one of the ships. They were very often extremely crowded. Many of the pilgrims died, and not just because they were elderly and ill when they traveled, but also because the conditions on these ships were very often extremely bad. And very often also the ships weren't particularly seaworthy. There are a number of really famous accidents where ships with huge numbers of people either sank or had serious trouble. One of these incidents, a ship which was deserted by the captain and crew in a storm near Aden in 1880 actually made it into the international literary history because it was the basis for a novel by Joseph Conrad called Lord Jim. Without going into detail, I would like to add, of course, that nowadays we have a renewed transport revolution with the airplanes, and nowadays the Ministry of Hajj is actually priding itself in having a transfer of pilgrims from the airport to Mecca in usually less than 24 hours. So you can see that this former phenomenon of people actually coming to Jeddah and having to stay there and having to organize their transport has more or less ceded. This might change, of course, with the increase in tourism, which nowadays is intended, but for a long time the idea was to get people as quickly to and out of Mecca as possible. Now, I mentioned that the pilgrimage was tightly controlled, organized locally by a guild, a professional association, the Tawafa, which you all know, or the Mutawifin. And the heads of this, or the head of the Tawafa guild was appointed by the Emir of Mecca, and this person who was theoretically responsible for all the pilgrims then divided this up by nationalities. And so you had one person responsible for the Egyptians, one for the Sudanese, one for the Southeast Asians. They were called Java, not Indonesians then, etc., etc. And of course, these had then quite a lot of other people working with them. And not only that in Mecca, but then they had deputies in Medina and Jeddah. And the ones in Jeddah with whom I'm concerned, and here you actually see a group of these gentlemen, they were responsible for receiving the pilgrims at that port. They had to organize their transfer across the customs, which very often caused big uproar, bring them through customs, a little bit like when I was received here at the airport by representatives from the center who came more or less to the airplane to pick me up and bring me to the passports office and then pick me up after that. It's a little bit like that. But then they also had to house them in Jeddah and then to organize their onward transport to Mecca with the help of another guild who would organize these nice camels, the so-called mukharijin. Of course, other pilgrims would have traveled by donkey or on foot even. And if the pilgrims returned via Jeddah, the Mutawifin, or rather the Wukala, were actually responsible for also getting them out of the country again, making sure that their passages on the ships were secured and so on. Of course, like nowadays, probably to a larger degree even, quite a number of pilgrims absconded or missed their pilgrims' guides, or perhaps didn't want to meet their pilgrims' guides, because there are lots of reports about the pilgrims' guides being party to, let's say, extortionate rates for pilgrims. So many people prefer to try to go on Hajj on their own, but then, of course, also to stay over, for example, and not travel back. And in the 20th century, there's an interesting phenomenon that after the Hajj ended, the Wukala would have actually traveled to the countries from where the pilgrims came in order to make already the contracts for the next year. And this was encouraged by King Abdulaziz bin Saud because the pilgrims were, in the early years of the kingdom, one of the most, or the most important source of income of the whole of the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, this is how it looked at the harbor when the pilgrims arrived. Young boys observed when a big ship was anchoring far away in the sea, and then these small boats had to actually go out and bring the pilgrims to the shore and navigate through the coral reefs. And not just the pilgrims, but also all the goods in their suitcases. And many pilgrims complained how, in spite of the good services of the mutawwifin, their luggage was taken apart in customs. They were asked to pay customs rates. And it seems that the mutawwifin, as well as government officials, were party to this fleecing of pilgrims. And old Jeddawis would even tell you, well, look, we had to live basically, and the Hajj season was when we made all the income for the entire year. The pilgrims were then taken to their houses or to their accommodation, and that could be very different. There were no hotels in those days. Rather, pilgrims could stay in these beautiful old Jeddawi houses. Sometimes a mutawwif would own an entire house and just rent it out when the pilgrims or other people who needed accommodation came. In many cases, also families moved to the highest floor of the house, or actually moved out of their houses and went to Taif or Mecca, where many had further houses, and rented out their houses during pilgrimage. Now, this is, of course, for the richer merchants, for the richer pilgrims. Poorer pilgrims stayed in vikalas or caravanserais, which were grouped around courtyards. They could stay in so-called ahwash, which were courtyards with rooms around for commercial purposes, or it could be pilgrims' hostels, ribats and arbita in Arabic. Here you have one which is still standing, and here you can see how these looked from the interior. That they were basically rooms centered around a courtyard. Nowadays, ribat basically means poorhouse. Not many people remember that at some time these were hostels. Some people stayed in Sufi convents, and some even in coffee houses. That's the really cheap accommodations. And the really poor people slept in the streets. And it's interesting, again, this was not ashwa'i, it wasn't random, but rather based on agreements between pilgrims' guides, for example, for the Sudanese pilgrims who had an agreement with the Umdat of Harat al-Sham of the northern quarter, so that in particular places pilgrims were allowed to camp within the city walls. As I said, accommodation depended on the rank of the visitors. The ruler or Begum of Bhopal, who went on Hajj in 1863, was first taken, she writes in her memoirs, to a stately home for a meal in her honor. And this could well have been a nice house like this. She then describes how a more important visitor arrived, an Egyptian princess, and so the Indian princess had to leave quickly and was ushered to a less stately home. Only few people, of course, received this kind of VIP treatment. And usually it would be either the Sharif of Mecca or the Ottoman Wali who would make sure that important state visitors who had been announced beforehand received such treatment. But also high-ranking scholars could count on being well received. The Egyptian reformer Mohammed Rashid Rida, who traveled in 1916, has an interesting account of how he arrived. He had a very bad sea passage, and he saw that the ship anchored far away. He saw these small sambuks, and he was really wary of how he and his mother, and I think his sister, who were traveling with him, would get to the shore. Before they could, however, consider how to do this, a motorboat arrived. They called it launch. And the person who disembarked was, and I quote Mohammed Rashid Rida, our generous Lord, Sheikh Mohammed Nassif, delegate of our Lord, the Grand Sharif of Mecca. It's the gentleman who's sitting here, and this is his house. And so Mohammed Rashid Rida actually was given a ride, with his family, of course, was given a ride on this nice motorboat and was then brought to this house where he was guest of honor for a couple of days, and Mohammed Nassif also had to pay for all the guests coming to Rashid Rida, presumably also for their dinners and coffees and so on. And this Nassif, in a sense, was a special case because his father and grandfather had already been representatives of the Ashraf or the Umara of Mecca. And this involved, of course, political functions, the reception of political guests, but also commercial transactions. And therefore, they needed this huge house to accommodate the visitors, but also it has huge storage rooms on the ground floor where, for example, grain could be stored. And that was another economic branch of the family, if you like. Plus, the Nassifs owned huge cisterns outside of the city, and thereby also could provide not only their own guests, but of course also other pilgrims with water, which was, of course, sold to them. So it was very valuable land, although you couldn't grow anything on it. Mohammed Nassif is also a special case because he was really not just one of the ayyan of Jeddah, but he was an intellectual with a wide network of scholars and merchants. And there's an interesting description by an Indian scholar who came in 1929 and was brought to a house which he didn't like. And so he actually went to Mohammed Nassif and said, well, could we please stay with you because we know you have a nice roof terrace, which is windy in the evenings and not quite as hot and sweltering as the place where these people were housed. A Syrian scholar who had also met Mohammed Nassif on pilgrimage and then had moved to Jeddah recounts how he visited the Nassif house very often and always met Syrians, Egyptians, Moroccans, and others. And I quote, "His house was a hotel, only cheaper than that because food and drink was for free. I once met there somebody during dinner. When I returned 2 weeks later, he was still there. After another month, I still saw that person around. I therefore asked Mohammed Nassif, 'Who is this man who stays with you?' And he answered, 'It's a good man whom I met in Lebanon once, and who seems to have business in town, but I don't know his name,' which also shows that this almost functioned like a hotel. Now, the important thing about all of the stories I've told you so far is that these pilgrims did not just come and wander around like backpack tourists do nowadays. They were actually managed quite tightly. They were managed by the pilgrims' guides. They were sometimes managed by colonial governments, by the Ottoman government. And even when they were in the houses, you find memoirs which say, well, if I had to go to the souk, somebody from the house came with me. So even then, people made sure that they kind of had an idea what these people were up to and were doing. And I think this is an important point when we think about how the city could actually cope with this influx of strangers, because through the presence of locals, the strangeness was to some extent mediated. Now, those pilgrims who overstayed their welcome, as well as those who came to Jeddah in search of livelihoods, either settled in the town or in one of the outlying suburbs, like this African suburb, which used to be to the south of Jeddah, and which was called Nakutu. If they didn't live there, they could also rent small apartments, of course, in the houses or in the wikalas. If they arrived as children, they would very often stay with the people for whom they worked. So they would find a job, and then their master would usually take them in as a sabi who would sleep somewhere on the ground floor of the house. And in this, these, I call them now immigrants, are actually very similar to the slaves who were also imported and who formed about 20% of the population of Jeddah, if we are to believe consular reports. They were also imported at an age of anything between 8 and 14 or 16 years, and they were also very often taken into the houses. Obviously, there's a difference in that legally they weren't free, but there's a lot of similarity here, but that's a different topic. Now, how were these people then integrated into the society of Jeddah? Well, the first thing is, of course, through the families, if they stayed with families. And if they rented, there was a strong tradition which required of anybody who moved to Jeddah, no matter whether it was from the next village or from India or wherever, that they would need to go around and introduce themselves to the neighbors. It's something which we still have as a good neighborly practice in Germany when we move to a new place, but by no means it's required. Whereas in Jeddah, this was really a tradition which was very strong and very much enforced. The second level of integration was through professional institutions. If somebody came who wanted to work in the port, who wanted to work in some kind of manufacturing business, a baker or a bricklayer or stone cutter rather, or whatever, these people needed to be admitted to the guilds, to the hirfa or taifa. And these guilds didn't have guild houses, but they met in regular coffee shops, and everybody would know where the coffee shop of the Mukharrijin or of the of the Ma'adi, of the seamen, etc., would be. And the guilds were not just responsible for professional standards and for labor conflict, but also for this acceptance of new members. And of course, they also served social functions. They had particular traditions, social events which they did together. For example, the seamen, the Ma'adi, went before the Eid all together to the souk to buy specific clothes, which they actually only wore during the Eid and then put away again. And next year they would buy new ones, in a sense also to show their high status. But newcomers would become part of this and thereby also be integrated into society. And then the third level was the participation in neighborhood activities, ritualized visits between the quarters at the end of Ramadan, for example, neighborhood celebrations with the performance of the mizmar, a local dance, on the occasion of weddings, and people would join, notably men, particular neighborhood coffee shops where they would go every afternoon to have their coffee and become part of a local shilla or group of friends. And of course, there was the participation in religious celebrations beyond the regular Friday prayer. And there was a very rich calendar of occasions. In Safar, there were excursions outside of the town with picnics and camping, with horse, donkey, and camel races. In Rabi' al-Awwal and Thani, there were nightly recitations of the Quran or the Mawlid Nabawi. In the Ottoman times, Rabi' al-Awwal and the Mawlid Nabawi in particular was celebrated with the illumination of warboats and illumination of official buildings, a recitation of the Mawlid in the Hanafi mosque, which was, the Madhab al-Hanafi was the Ottoman official madhab, so that was a particularly important point, and there would be Sufi processions on these occasions. In Shaban, again, groups of people would go on excursions, often with music bands. And then, of course, in Ramadan, there were all sorts of preparations for the Eid and all sorts of rites and traditions accompanying it. And when the Eid was announced, everybody went to the morning prayer and from there to a place called Al-Mashhad outside of Bab al-Mecca for the Eid prayer. And then in Dhul Qaidah, everybody would start to prepare for the arrival of the pilgrims, and for the arrival of the mahmal from Egypt, in which the cloth for the Kaaba was transported. When the mahmal arrived in Jeddah, it was brought to a Haush in Harat al-Bahr, one of the quarters near the port. An Egyptian commander of the Hajj in 1901, Ibrahim Rifat Pasha, describes how on the second day of his presence in Jeddah, 600 regular and irregular Ottoman soldiers turned up for a celebration of the Mahmal. They were accompanied by 80 musicians of the local military corps, as well as Egyptian musicians who had come with the Mahmal, probably on Hajj. And then it was paraded across town. And you had these kind of scenes when all male people from Jeddah and many of the children, of course, would turn out and accompany the Mahmal and walk around town, very often with music. And there's a memoir about Hashemite times and early Saudi practices, which describes how people looked forward to the arrival of the Mahmal and how the officials accompanying it distributed food and sometimes even coins to the people of the city. And as long as the Egyptians were in town, people would daily come to visit the Mahmal, listen to the music, and perform the mizmar in honor of the Mahmal. Now, in Ottoman times, these festivities combined religious anticipation of the pilgrimage with a more political aspect of fostering loyalty to the larger Ottoman Empire. And Egypt, of course, was considered to be part of this empire in spite of the British occupation. And this also explains why the Mahmal had this very high political sensitivity in early Saudi times, when eventually it was abolished after a confrontation between the Egyptian troops accompanying it and Najdi Bedouin in Mecca in 1926. And then to complete the religious calendar, many of the people involved in the pilgrimage traveled after the pilgrims had departed to Medina and performed something called Lockup, which I think continued until the 1950s. I don't know if it's still happening. And sorry, I forgot something which is also very interesting, because so far I've mainly talked about male celebrations. During the Hajj, when the men went with the pilgrims to Mecca, because very many of them worked as wukala or in the transport business, the women would have a big carnival in the city of Jeddah and prepare dresses, have dances in the streets and so on. And again, this is something in which both newly immigrated women as well as slave women would actually participate very much. So again, we can see that through these many professional, social, and religious activities, the strangers became eventually part of Jeddawi society. And I did a lot of interviews in Jeddah, and when I asked old people, well, how did you know whether somebody had become a Jeddawi or not? Because you still know he comes from Hind or Hadramaut or wherever. They would say, well, if they put on the Jeddawi dress and if they speak the Lahja Jeddawiya, then they are Jeddawis. Now, how was this locally conceptualized? I think nowadays such an openness to integrate and accommodate strangers would probably be called cosmopolitanism, even if in Europe we emphasize very much that cosmopolitanism means that you have to have different religions, whereas here we are dealing with very many different ethnicities, but of course everybody was Muslim, although from different madahib, and there were Sunnah and Shia and Bahra and so on and so forth. So I think, you can easily translate the concept of cosmopolitanism. There is, however, also a local way of, cosmopolitanism is a Western term, but there's a local way of talking about this, although interestingly enough, the local way actually only refers to the pilgrimage. And this is Diyafat Duyuf Beit Allah al-Haram. Now this builds obviously on a local culture of hospitality, which is combined with a very high value given to the pilgrimage and thereby also to the pilgrims. And by serving the pilgrims, in a sense, you also do something religiously good and obtain, if you want to use the terminology of Bourdieu, cultural capital. Already before Islam, Mecca had been an extraterritorial, holy, and hence protected place where the peace had to be kept, the peace for trade, for example. And this became even more accentuated through the need to serve the guests of God after Islam had arrived. Now, the interesting thing is that people in Jeddah talk about their city as the entrance hall of Mecca, the Dihliz. And they thus use the image of a house, and so Jeddah actually becomes part of the holy space of Mecca by being, although only the entrance hall, not the central place, obviously. Jeddah Dihliz Mecca is the usual term, and if we want to imagine a Dihliz, it is strictly speaking only this small hallway here, but you can see here's a nice sitting room to the left, and there's another nice sitting room actually to the right of this entrance hall. And very often the term of Dihliz is not just used for the hallway, but actually for this whole reception area on the ground floor. So it's a term from local architecture which is used to conceptualize this welcoming spirit of Jeddah. Now, how does this very religiously inflected notion square with the very commercial aspects of the Hajj, which I've mentioned when I said that people were actually fleeced? Locally, people do not see any contradiction, and there are actually very many Hijazi proverbs which discuss the pilgrimage as a spiritual as well as a material necessity. One of them is al-Hajj haja. It's a haja, a spiritual haja, but it's also a haja iqtisadiyya, an economic haja. Nowadays, we would be talking of religious tourism, which constitutes, so to speak, the framework which makes the presence of foreigners not only palatable, but through the notion of the Muslim Ummah, also allows them to enter houses and become, at least temporarily, part of a larger Muslim community. So actually things which normally, socially, would not necessarily be very welcome to have strangers actually live in your house, here become in this wider conceptual image, quite acceptable. And in this context, we also need to understand something which I think is peculiar for the Hijaz, at least as far as the kingdom is concerned, the possibility of in-marriage, because many of the new arrivals rather quickly married, for example, the daughter of their business partners, and thereby, of course, also became an integral part of local society. Now, if we return to the term cosmopolitanism, it has, at least for a long time, recently the meaning of it is changing again, which is quite interesting, but for a very long time it had a very positive connotation. But when it first appeared in European parlance in the late 19th century, it was actually something very suspicious. It was about people who did not really have a clear wataniya. They did not belong to one particular place. And I think there's a slight reflection of this in a Saudi context when people in the Hijaz are, or at least were, there was a big discussion about this, of which I'm aware, were called Tushat al-Baha or Baqayat al-Hajj, which basically means you're not proper Arabs. You're all these weird immigrants who married local people, and you don't have a proper nasab, qabali, and so on. And it's interesting that when I discussed this notion of the of Jeddah as the dahliz of Mecca with people from Mecca, they said, yeah, but the dahliz is also something very, very suspicious. It's the ground floor, it's cool in summer, granted, but it's also where the strangers come in, where the porters come who bring things to the house. So yes, it's the place where you welcome people, but it's also a suspicious place. So again, this is somehow linked to this ambivalent notion also of cosmopolitanism, which I mentioned. Well, nowadays, obviously, religious tourism is very much hailed as a way to diversify the Saudi economy, and it's mentioned very prominently in the Vision 2030. And the hope is that the guests of God voluntarily prolong their stay, not just in Mecca and Medina, but also in Jeddah, that they come to Madan Saleh, that they come to Dar'iyah, and that they travel around Saudi Arabia, and therefore increase the income of the country through tourism. Perhaps one day all of Saudi Arabia will consider itself to be a kind of dahliz of Mecca, and the marriage of religion and capital, on which much of Jeddah's past prosperity depended, and which is already so evident in the touristic infrastructure of Mecca and Medina, will become even more widespread. And with this, I thank you for your attention.